Great. And we're back. This is the Colombia Calling podcast, episode 475. My very special guest is Jill Lederach. She is the assistant professor of peace studies at Chapman University. For those of you who don't know Chapman, it's in Orange County, California. And we're going to discuss her new book, brought out by Stanford University Press. It's called Feel the Grass Grow, Ecologies of Slow Peace in Colombia. So welcome on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've been listening to the podcast for a long time. I'm glad to have a chance to be talking with you.
Well, you'll make me blush. You'll make me blush. Thank you so much. I really enjoy, obviously, the more politically oriented podcast. And I know that my listeners know that. But we do have to mix it up. Otherwise, I would just go from academic to academic talking about it. But so that's why I have to be measured. And now you've got a book out, and I was alerted to it by Stanford University Press. I guess they do a Google press in English about Colombia, and I pop up. But so it's always flattering to be contacted, and I've plowed my way through the book, and it's really a long study and a very deep look at the Montes de Maria.
Yeah.
Let's go into that straight away. For my listeners, let's start from the very beginning. Tell us where the Montes de Maria is located.
Yeah, so Montes de Maria is located on the northern Caribbean coast of Colombia. It's between Cartagena and Sincelejo, and so it has 15 different municipalities. Both Bolivar and Sucre are part of the territory, but for those who live in Montes de Maria, it's kind of there's a very strong territorial identity, a very strong history, one that's really rooted in forms of collective resistance that date back to escape and freedom from colonization and from enslavement. And so it was a refuge in many ways for an intercultural group of Afro-Colombians, of campesinos, and of indigenous communities who found refuge in this sort of mountainous, very rural area, kind of between these two major cities, Sincelejo and Cartagena. And it's gorgeous. So if anyone can visit, I highly recommend that opportunity to be there. Really rich cultural practices, music traditions, singing, poetry. So it's a beautiful place, beautiful history.
It really does. I mean, it's brimming with culture, especially when you talk about the music. And I know of people going up there to do bird watching as well. But let's get this out there quickly. I mean, I live in the Andes. I'm from England. We don't really have mountains, but I live in the Andes here in Bogota. The Montes de Maria are not mountains. It's just kind of hills. but as I know, the Spanish didn't really they wanted plains, didn't they? They wanted flat to cultivate and to exploit. And so the hills were kind of off limits, and it became, I would suppose, like a big geographical palenque, sort of stronghold for indigenous and maybe escaped slaves and so on. And that's what you see in the sort of I would say the breakdown of the population these days. It's campesinos, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it is, I grew up kind of partly in Virginia, for those who are kind of familiar with the region, and then call home Colorado is where I call home. And so it's sort of the difference between the Shenandoah kind of area of Blue Ridge Mountains and the Rocky Mountains. Very different, but still a kind of difficult terrain. It was deeply kind of forested terrain. It was hard to reach, not easy to cultivate. And so it served as a sort of refuge for a lot of people, and really became one of the strongholds for self-liberation movements, for Maroon movements, of people who had been enslaved and who are escaping that. And so that sort of intercultural identity is very strong, and it's strongly related to people's relationship with the land. So something that's really important when we talk about campesinos or small farmers, oftentimes that term is used in a way that is distinct from Afro-descendant or indigenous individuals. But in Montes de Maria, that term is a kind of social political term that has deep relationship to the land. And so people simultaneously identify as more than one thing. You can be Black and campesino, indigenous and campesino. And so that category has always been a plural category in this particular region, which I think is important to note when we're looking at regional differences across Colombia and the ways that people's identities are deeply rooted to specific histories and geographies, but also their relationships to land and their material practices with the land.
I think there's so much in this book, the Feel the Grass Grow, that I want to talk about. But when you mention land, it brings me to what's going on right now. I mean, obviously right now, and obviously last week's episode, and I had my friend Erwin Liz, who is of the NASA community, and we were talking about his perspective on the rescue of the children in Caquetá, Guaviare, the Mukutui children, and his perspective, an indigenous perspective of the relationship to the jungle and to the land. And we consider this, but you consider it also in the Montes de Maria. You have to. And well, obviously there's the underlying issue of land ownership and land reform. Colombia's number one on the peace accords with the FARC signed in 2016, President Santos and so on. And perhaps the underlying issue, many other issues that creating the conflict and the extension of the conflict obviously are woven in, but land remains. And when you talk about land, you have a section in the book when you there's a chapter on I think it's the witnessing the avocados die. And that was in 1995. It was a soil fungus. It was the death of the avocado tree in the narrative of the armed conflict. And I guess you and I, from let's say a Northern European perspective, look at it as, it was a fungus, it was a blight, but the people there see it as, it's a whole, isn't it? It's the whole. It's not, the conflict is also affecting the environment.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. One of the things that really emerged in the work that I did, and this kind of took place over the course of close to 10 years, working collaboratively with campesino movements in Montes de Maria to do this research, was the central role of environment and how people understood and narrated both their experience of the violence, so the ways that the violence affected their wider environmental relationships, their relationships with the land. And so not just in terms of legal terms or in terms of property, but in terms of living and vibrant relationship and connection to the land, but also then necessarily informs centrally how they understand peace. People often would say we also have to reconcile with the earth. The war has been violent with the earth, and we must reconcile with her. And this became particularly poignant in the Alta Montaña, which is the high mountain area of Montes de Maria. It's part of El Carmen de Bolívar, so right in the heart of the territory, where a fungus, the Phytophthora cinnamomi, was introduced kind of at the height of forced displacements in the area, or at the beginning of a lot of the massacres that took place, and a lot of the forced displacements of entire communities. And part of what, there are varied kind of hypotheses about how that fungus was introduced. Some people, are fairly adamant that there was real intent around that introduction, whereas other people, have said maybe it came through because of the tracking of armed groups. So campesinos are very careful about what boots they wear to tend the land, just so that they don't introduce new diseases or fungus. And all of a sudden you had all of this armed activity mobilizing in the region, which had the possibility of introducing new fungi, but there isn't necessarily intent there. But what everybody really agrees upon in terms of the fungus is that because of the forced displacements, the removal of people from their land, there were not people there to actually attend to the fungus, to attend to the avocado trees, to address the spread of that fungus, to stop it in its tracks. And there was a total lack of any kind of institutional response. And so you had urgent letters over the course of a decade, right? So there's a real paradox and like urgency over 10 years to state institutions that had collapsed in that region, who are no longer visiting that region, who are no longer willing to travel to that area because of the armed conflict. And that led to the 90% of the avocado trees eventually dying, which was really a whole forest ecology. So these are not Hass avocados. This wasn't a kind of monoculture avocado forest. This was a kind of varied mixture of old growth avocado criollo, or kind of, traditional avocado trees that had a dramatic effect on the ecology. And so a group of campesinos actually mobilized in 2010, and 1,600 of them marched from kind of the highest peak of the Alta Montaña, and they're marching towards Cartagena, which is quite a distance by foot. And they met in San Jacinto, which is kind of in the middle, and signed 91 accords with the state. And one of their primary demands was recognition of the avocado as a victim of the war. That this is, a direct result of the armed conflict, but also that the avocado, wasn't just a crop. It was a living being, an entity, a central figure that was part of a wider ecology. And it was really that mobilization that gave rise to the movement in the area that is known as the peaceful process of reconciliation and integration of the Alta Montaña. It's a very long name, powerful name.
Always the way here, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. The recognition of the avocado as a victim and a living being, an entity, it's very similar to the work that's been done again to recognize the Atrato River. These are things that have suffered. And yes, I've had the people from the name escapes me, but they do the forensic investigations.
Okay.
And it's fascinating that they can see through the conflict how the forest dies back over decades and things like that. And it's amazing when you look at it, and the mangroves and how these things suffer. But I wanted to touch, I think it's very interesting, on this fungus. And well, right now, and I hadn't thought about the boots coming through, obviously. Mm-hmm. I would like to imagine that it wasn't deliberate, like environmental warfare. I would like to imagine it was just on the boots. But it makes me think, and you did quote someone I've had on the show before as well, Lina Pinto, mm-hmm. and Lina being an expert in leishmaniasis and tropical diseases. Right. We came to a conclusion when we were discussing it, is like the expansion of the armed conflict in Colombia is responsible for the vast expansion of leishmaniasis through these parts of the jungle. And so there's a very similar look when you look at the boots traipsing through. And I think we should give our listeners a bit of background. We've got the campesinos, we've got the different communities living there. First, it was the FARC that came through, I want to say, and then when were the ELN and then the paramilitaries, or is it a mix between the last two?
It's a mix. So especially the Alta Montaña has a very complex history, and it's often hard to have that history dated by people. So there's, some differences in when people put dates, and I don't want to, sometimes that is, people will see that as a sort of inaccuracy. I actually think that reflects the accuracy of the experience of living through a war. Where armed groups and their relationships with communities who are living in areas that were under territorial dispute, violent dispute, it really produced over the years an experience of chaos. And so you had kind of in early phases the PRT as well as the ELN and the FARC. But the FARC really kind of settled there, and one of their fronts was located in the Alta Montaña. You also have a military base that has it continues to operate at the kind of one of the highest peaks in the Alta Montaña, that has a helicopter landing pad. So you had the military also based in the Alta Montaña, and you had the paramilitaries not necessarily based, but constantly moving through. And so it was one of the key corridors. It connected the lower region of Montes de Maria and the Caribbean Sea to some of the major highways, into the sort of forested areas where the FARC had kind of created a base. And it's really important, I think, to understand the ways that civilian populations, campesino communities who did not displace, who chose to remain resistant in the face of extreme forms of violence, really found themselves caught in between multiple and competing armed groups, and they were also often stigmatized by all of them. So if you were located near the FARC, you were stigmatized as a member of the FARC. If you were located near the paramilitaries, on the side where the paramilitaries operated, you were stigmatized as paramilitaries. If you were located near the military, you're stigmatized as military. And so a number of the individuals I work with, were often on hit lists of all of these groups. And so their names rotated across them, right? So it wasn't as if, which I think speaks to that experience of chaos, of being caught in between, of widespread fear and repression that people lived under for over a decade. So a really complex history, many armed groups in and out of this region. I think the kind of three that had the most impact, who kind of created bases in this area, were the military, so the state, the paramilitaries that worked in very close collaboration with the state, and the FARC, the 35th Front of the FARC.
And of course, you were doing research for a long time, between 2014 and 2021. So this period of time, you saw a lot, and I'm sure you have a lot of not so pleasant anecdotes to share. Let's not go into those. One of the anecdotes over in the book, though, is Salvador, who just out of nowhere kind of says why his name's Salvador. Perhaps you'd share that with us.
Yeah, this is a really close collaborator and dear friend of mine. Naun Alvarez Gonzalez is his birth name. And he was one of the coordinators who really helped to start the youth wing of the campesino movement. They call themselves the Youth Peace Provokers, Jóvenes Provocadores de Paz. So this is an intergenerational movement, which I think is really important to think about, to find hope within. And Naun, we were in I was visiting his community. It's right near a reservoir. It's absolutely gorgeous. A really long history of resistance in that community. And we were just enjoying a relaxing afternoon in the hammocks, and all of a sudden, he told me that his nickname was Salvador, which I'd kind of heard, but I, hadn't thought very much of it. People have different kinds of nicknames for different reasons. Salvador, of course, means savior, or, one who saves. And he went on to explain that he was given that name because a guerrilla group who he's not actually able to identify which guerrilla group this was at the time, because so many moved in and out of his community. So especially the ELN, and both the ELN and the FARC, had taken his mother and his aunt at gunpoint. His mother was very far along in her pregnancy, and under duress, she went into labor. And as she was going into labor, a torrential downpour hit. And if you've ever been in rural communities in Colombia, when these torrential downpours hit, it is very intense.
And
the wind was just whipping, and it actually started to damage the roof. And so you had a laboring woman under a thatched roof where water was starting to come in, where the wind was blowing. And actually, members of this guerrilla group put down their arms patched the roof until she gave birth and left. And that's Naun's birth story. And so, you know, he tells the story with this smile on his face from ear to ear. It's clearly shaped his biography, his sense of self, both in terms of what it means to resist that kind of violence, what it means to be born under duress, but also the sort of strength and courage of his mother, of his aunt. And for him, really what it means to be a peace builder, which is something that he, you know, deeply identifies as a constructor de paz, as a peace builder in his community. And, you know, later on, his family is stigmatized and targeted by the paramilitaries because the guerrilla had come and left and nobody died. And so they were seen as, oh, it must, they're, you know, all of a sudden they're sort of stigmatized as collaborating with the guerrilla. And that's often how that operated. Although I would say, I think there were other underlying motivations. Particularly his father owned a lot of the boats that would transport people across the reservoir that connects the lower end of Montes de Maria, Maria la Baja, to the high mountain region. And so it was a sort of critical transportation infrastructure. And I think, you know, a lot of the youth that I worked with were born into the war and have chosen also to dedicate their lives now to rebuilding their communities. And in many ways, not often knowing what it even meant to rebuild, right? Not having a memory of a before. And so the intergenerational solidarity, the intergenerational practices of kind of memory, of telling these sorts of stories, you know, not just of the violence, but of the kinds of solidarity economies, of the kinds of ecologies, of the relationships that one had with the wider environment in that area. You know, those stories become really central to how youth imagine futures of dignified life for themselves, imagine something beyond war. And I think it is in that imagining that a kind of projection sustains the work that they're doing in a context where there is still severe inequality, severe poverty, ongoing violence, especially in the last couple of years, really high levels of recruitment of youth by the Clan del Golfo that has really moved into this region. And so I think, you know, that piece of campesino storytelling, of oral history, of the sharing of stories like Naun's birth story become really central to how people sustain and continue to work towards a different kind of world for themselves.
It's just, I mean, it's kind of staggering because, you know, I think I wanted to jump in earlier, that large march of people that got to San Jacinto, I think I was stuck behind it in a traffic jam in 2010 because I think I remember it. But no, that said, that's a digression here. I wonder why, you know, I wonder, you know, these ideas bounce around in my head and the confusion as to why this area. Perhaps we could just take a very superficial look and say, but why here? Why in the Montes de Maria? It's only a couple hours from Cartagena. It's only a couple hours like down to Mompos, tourist destinations, but right here. And so when I talk to Colombians who want to come down, they always ask. And I'm like, well, no, you stick to the road. Stick to the road through Carmen de Bolivar, San Jacinto, and you're fine. Or if they're coming across the country, because it does connect east and west quite a lot with that road between Carmen and Bosconia and in there. But why is this area so disputed all the time?
I think there are a number of reasons, right? You have access to the Caribbean Sea, especially on, you know, what would be considered Maria la Baja, or the lower region of Montes de Maria. And then you have direct access to what, you know, is a more forested region, is really rich, fertile land, and a sort of highway system that allows for a kind of transportation and connection between major cities and between major ports. So you have agricultural opportunity, you know, you have an increasingly extensive palm oil industry that has moved in, which has really direct ties, actually. You can map on the expansion of the palm oil industry to paramilitary massacres and forced displacements that took place, especially under the Uribe administration. So you have this sort of rich, fertile land, rich, fertile waterways. It is in part what created a space of refuge for people, a kind of food sovereignty for people historically who lived there. And then you also have these really key kind of access points. And on top of that, when you're thinking about kind of where the FARC created bases, some of the ways they were able to remain in sort of forested, a little bit more remote areas. Also historically, when they initially arrived, arriving with a kind of political conscientization, with a kind of political ideology that was really rooted in advocating for different kinds of land reforms. And I think that got distorted over the years, but let's not forget where some of that history began and why the FARC might have, arrived to this region. Montes de Maria is also the birthplace of one of the largest campesino movements in Colombia, the ANUC, in the 1970s. And so this area has this really rich history of collective organizing, of organizing from the grassroots up, of moments of enormous hope in terms of shifting kinds of power relationships within an elite political culture, through that sort of intercultural coalition building that movements like the ANUC really represented. So you have backlash against the ANUC as they were gaining power from kind of elite landowners in the area as well. And I think both guerrilla groups interested in joining or finding support from campesino organizations, campesino movements, as well as kind of paramilitaries that emerge really as self-defense forces for landowning elites. This is it's really a space where a lot of those things converged, even though it's not a coca growing region, right? This is different than some of the regions that have been heavily hit by the armed conflict, but it has key transportation areas, a really interesting history, especially as that relates to land reform, relates to what it means to build power from the grassroots. Really challenging and moments where there's real sense of change in terms of the challenge that the campesino movement posed to an elite political class, and fertile land. So a kind of agricultural history, whether that's tobacco, that kind of started to come into Montes de Maria and then later led to leagues of campesino organizers in the 1920s, or whether that's more recently with the emergence of palm oil and the palm oil industry. I think those are dynamics that have really shaped the area.
Definitely. So now there's a word that popped up a lot in that last intervention, and it's the word the elites. And I don't think we could do a discussion about your book and about all of this without mentioning them. Hopefully, I'm sure you've read Jenny Pierce's with Juan Velasco, David Velasco, or Juan Velasco, I can't remember, but yeah. It's phenomenal though. And one of the elite families, one of the heads of the elite families is a guest often in my hotel. When he wants to pay, he doesn't like paying. He saw my library and a large selection of books about the Colombian conflict and gave me a lecture on the benefits of paramilitarism in the region. So leading on from that anecdote, and I'm not mentioning names, because I still feel like I'm a bit like Robin Hood. If he stays, the money goes from him. Because basically everything that enters goes to pay my staff. So,
right.
So I feel like Robin Hood in that respect. But with that in mind, I mean, you obviously are not from there when you spend all this time there. You didn't get yourself into any trouble.
No, I think in a lot of ways, so I first started going to Montes de Maria in 2010, and those were shorter trips. And certainly, in 2010, there was still quite a lot of tension, a lot of territorial dispute. But a lot of the time that I spent in Montes de Maria would have been labeled, and I'm critical of this term post-conflicto, post-conflict, which is, a real misnomer when you think about the ongoing forms of violent conflict that exist, the ongoing forms of dispute that exist, but also conflict is a part of life. And so what is post-conflict, I'm not sure is a helpful term for us to use, but it was in a period that, had much less kind of armed activity. And so I would go through military checkpoints, often had to meet with generals to introduce myself, especially to pass through where the military base was to get to different communities. Certainly know a number of people who have demobilized from various armed groups, including the paramilitaries who live in the region, in those communities, who have been reintegrated through informal processes. But I'm grateful that I have not necessarily had direct experiences, even though very aware of the sort of security challenges. I would say that this isn't without great intention and deliberation. And so people that I work with have done a lot of this research was collaborative. I worked with the coordinating committee of the movement. I worked with a local peacebuilding organization named Sembrando Paz, which means sowing seeds of peace, that has longstanding relationships in the region, has been based there for a long time. And every week is a sort of security assessment. What's going on, where, who's moving through where, what kinds of interactions are happening. So there were certainly different assassinations that happened while I was there. There were certainly death threats that occurred. One of the main leaders of the campesino movement, the peaceful process, Jorge Luis Montes, 6 months following that nonviolent march, he was arrested and detained and imprisoned for 4 years, and then released through the transitional justice mechanism of the HEP. And he was sentenced to 40 years in prison and accused of the highest crimes that you can imagine as a member of the FARC, which he's never been part of. And so he has kind of refused to put himself on the list of the FARC. The FARC actually had a public statement saying that Jorge has never been part of their organization, as part of his case went forward. But he's really in legal limbo because by not putting himself on the list of the FARC, he excludes himself from the transitional justice mechanisms of the HEP, of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. And yet he's been accused of, his crimes are under the rubric of the FARC. So it's a really complicated and unjust case. The former late High Commissioner of Human Rights in Colombia, Todd Howland, called this an emblematic case of, this is the kinds of more difficult and complex forms of violence that emerged from the massive arbitrary detentions, the incarceration of campesinos who were stigmatized by the state as being part of the guerrilla. And so you had, throughout the time that I've lived there, these sorts of death threats, these sorts of direct forms of incarceration. But I think especially as somebody who is kind of a white US citizen, I have not experienced the kind of stigmatization that the people that I work with do on a regular basis.
No, and we have to support and celebrate the work they do in the face of such risks that continue today. I mean, that's the truth of it. It's as you said, varied forms of violence, and you were mentioning the sort of misnomer of post-conflict, and I usually say post-accord for most things. And then you've got another quote in your book where it's the tension between peace signing and peace building, which of course I think plays off very well. But we don't have that much more time, but I can tell that you can talk for as long as needed. But I wanted to, when you talk about these death threats and so on, is the quote from a very well known, I would say, they'd probably call a community leader, a peace builder, Amilcar Rocha Gonzalez, and it's in your book, and it says, every time we try to claim our most basic rights, we just receive death threats, and that's just the day-to-day reality. But before we sort of start winding this down, I also want to, it's a different world, the Montes de Maria, even to Cartagena, even, well, obviously to Bogota, Medellin, and other cities. And I thought we should sort of celebrate a little bit as well of the costeño culture that you get in there, because we've talked about the music, we've talked about the culture, the vibrancy, but it's Hoka Beth's quote, and she says, walking slowly, in her account, Hoka Beth, is not a form of lethargy limited to notions of speed, but rather a way of inhabiting the world. And I think this encompasses so much of what you're saying about being in the place at the time and how you interact with your environment. Here in the city, we're getting somewhere, but there it's about engaging. And I think that comes into the how you configure peace building and community and so on. And that's what I'm taking from your book, totally. But I also want to say one more thing, and then I will shut up and you can talk. But there's each time that there's sort of like a new wave of efforts, a new wave of government agencies or international NGOs or what have you coming in, because the Montes de Maria has been, a test case for so many different efforts. And the disconnect between government or international aid and assistance and the needs on the ground seems so tangible in your book by the experiences of the people. You can see that, nothing's a surprise. Sure, they're coming back. Nothing, things change, but they change in a different way. And then obviously one group leaves, aid group, and another arrives. And there's this perpetual cycle. I feel, or I felt when I was reading it, a certain degree of wariness. It's like, I don't know. How do you react to this?
Yeah, it is exhausting. I mean, and for me, I'm not even directly a recipient, right? I'm an observer. I'm a participant observer. But to be in literally the same kind of meeting over the course of 10 years with the victims unit, where every meeting was a new person coming in to do a diagnostic of the violence. And the first time I experienced it, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And Naun was next to me and he was like, I can't believe we're doing this again. And I was like, I wonder what he means by that. And 10 years later, they're doing the same thing. And so you have a changeover in leadership. You have a shift from, doing something under the victims law to doing it now under the peace accords. And all of that is a way of sort of, I think, pretending or performing a kind of fulfillment without actually fulfilling materially what is constitutional rights for people, the right to healthcare, the right to education, which is what they're putting in these accords. And so one of the things that I found really helpful that I started to hear over and over again is that people started, campesino organizers, I heard this throughout Montes de Maria, would talk about this in terms of fotos y firmas, participation limited to just fotos y firmas, photos and signatures. And if you've ever been to any of these meetings, the first thing that is passed around is an attendance sheet. And Roxani Cristalli has done fabulous work, actually looking at the ways that state bureaucrats in the victims unit themselves see the attendance sheet as one of the primary forms of action. That is how they measure their impact. That is how they measure the work being done. Right? But an attendance sheet isn't a material response or fulfillment of what has been agreed upon and what has been guaranteed in law. And so to experience that over and over, this kind of performance sense of a shallow form of action where it's taking a photo, sending it across the Twitter waves, and then having people sign these attendance sheets over, to do that repeated. It gives a sense of a kind of fast-paced experience that is perpetually delayed, right? So there is this paradox. And I translate this term that came up, we need to build paz sin prisa, peace without hurry. I translate quite liberally into slow peace, because I think it actually gets at the different aspects of what campesino organizers, campesino peace builders are calling for in terms of a shift from fotos y firmas, from photos and signatures, as kind of project-based repetition of meetings that kind of masquerade as a form of action without any kind of material implementation, to a shift to a much more relationally grounded, historically attuned process that actually leads to deep structural transformations. And so that kind of call to build paz sin prisa, peace without hurry, or slow peace, is not about making an already sluggish bureaucracy more sluggish. And it's not necessarily suggesting the state is fulfilling what it's agreed upon. It's actually a call to shift the way that these short-term interventions that then cycle into, this kind of perpetually delayed process for people. How do you actually shift that dynamic? And I think that quote from Huckabee really speaks to this idea of slowness, where people in the city would remark on how campesinos arrived late, or the meetings went so long, or they didn't get down to like the meeting points or the agenda until like noon. But here you are in a community where people have understood and seen themselves as enemies, as deep-seated enemies for a decade, shaking hands. They've walked 5 hours. They woke up at 4 a.m. to arrive to this meeting. They're advocating for reparations, for a repair of their social and economic fabric. And they're doing that together. And they're creating a space for that together. That's not empty, right? That's not a kind of lethargy. That is a way of inhabiting the world and approaching peace that is fundamentally different than, driving in an SUV, passing around an attendance sheet, and driving back to the capital city the same day. And that gap is very real, and it has real political and social consequences. And it, in this book, and I think part of that exhaustion that maybe you felt is the way that it violates people's dignity. There is a disrespect in the way that those meetings are carried out, in the ways that campesino knowledge of their own communities, of the work that they're doing in their communities, of their understanding of the work of peace building, of their commitment to it, the way that that's elided or erased, and how these interventions on these kind of short-term project bases with experts flying in and out of the territory are carrying them out. And so I hope, on the one hand, it's a critique, but I also hope there's a sort of generosity in that critique, a possibility of kind of lifting out what campesino peace building actually looks like, what it feels like, what it offers for us for thinking about peace differently, and kind of adds to a really rich body of literature in the Colombian context on the work of peace building. I think Colombia is known often for the violence, but wow, when you think about creative forms of peace building, the research that has emerged on tremendous forms of conflict transformation and peace work, Colombia to me is where we ought to be looking for those creative solutions. And so I hope the book kind of walks that balance, that you feel the exhaustion, because I want people to understand what it's like to be in those meetings over 10 years, but to not just stay there. What are the alternatives that something like slow peace, like a paz sin prisa, might offer us?
But I think that, I think that at the end, you finishing on that is a positive, because you take these victories, like the person who's shaking hands with a former enemy, or this is huge. This is a huge deal. You cannot minimize the importance of that. But then that's what I say to the detractors of the processes and all of these things, that it's not working. This thing doesn't happen from night to day. This is generational, and you know there has to be a whole construction process around it. But I thought then I will end on something I pulled from your book in the conclusion, and it's your quote. I advocate for a critical anthropology of peace building that understands peace as a historical, socio-ecological, and political process. And I think that's what you were saying right there at the end. And I think it's 100% on point. And well, for those of you who are academics or not an academic, but far more interested in peace building and the experience in Colombia, especially in a region such as the Montes de Maria, or just taking the experience from the Montes de Maria to try and maybe transpose it elsewhere in the world, plenty of conflict everywhere. You know, this is an excellent book on that front. So please check it out. Feel the Grass Grow: Ecologies of Slow Peace in Colombia by Jill Lederach. And it was released, I guess, last month by the Stanford University Press.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate it. I appreciate being, have the opportunity to be part of this podcast I've been listening to for a long time. Congrats to you on 10 years too. I'm very happy to, join this conversation. And for anyone interested in not just passing through Montes de Maria, Sembrando Paz has a beautiful farm. They're reforesting. You can look them up on Facebook and stay at their beautiful cabin.
Oh, wow.
So I encourage you not to just pass through or to be too concerned about it. There are ways to enjoy this incredible region of the world, incredible region of Colombia. And thanks to you, Richard, for this space, for your good questions.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I know you're moving across country, Nebraska, Colorado to California. I think you've made the right decision. Good luck on the move, and congratulations on the book. And thank you so much for agreeing to be on the Colombia Calling podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure's mine.
Bye-bye.